Akbar, aloha snack bar. Okay, that's my underwear, and I shouldn't put that on my head because I don't think it was clean. No, I'm joking, guys. But seriously, I was wearing that because you see this guy on MSNBC today on the program AM Joy, he actually called all Republicans terrorists. So I guess that includes me. This guy, Fernand Armandi, is a left-wing pollster and a pundit on MSNBC's program AM Joy. And he went on to say this, and I'll read you directly from him. Is it any surprise that the party that is pro-pay-to-play, pro-Putin, and now with Roy Moore, pro-pedophilia, all right, I'll stop there real quick. Pay-to-play, the Democrats get way more money from big corporations, and the left is always pushing these corporate agendas down our throats, right? They're the ones who have these useful idiots out there backing every corporate agenda they want to push. And they get way more money. The Republicans get money too. I won't argue there, but it's ridiculous to try to paint them as the only people who pay to play. Pro-Putin. Now, see, they don't like Putin, right? Because under Putin, Russia has embraced Christianity and nationalism, but the left loved Russia. For 40 years, the left got support from Russia, and there were countless investigations domestically into groups that were getting money from Russia or support from Russia or even spying for Russia here in the U.S. that were linked to the Communist Party USA, to the Democratic Party as a whole. And all these small groups you see now that call themselves Antifa, like the Revolutionary Abolitionist Movement or By All Means Necessary, all of them spawned from Russia money and Russia resources back when Russia was communist. But now that Russia is nationalist and says, screw communism, it sucks, it was horrible, the left hate Russia. And as far as Roy Moore, look, he was accused by people. One of his accusers was a DNC operative who worked for Hillary Clinton. So we can't believe what they're saying. But you know what? If he was convicted or they had actual proof, yeah, we would reject him in a second. Why hasn't the left rejected Bill Clinton? So hypocritical. Anyway, this guy goes on. It's not surprising we need to call them what they are, a domestic terrorist group. We need to vote them out and then after talk about locking them up. Now, there you go, guys. They want to call the right-wing terrorists, lock up Republicans. This is what I see as the logical conclusion to the left's efforts to subvert America and to destroy Western culture as a whole and just take out any opposition. We've seen this kind of rhetoric ratcheting up, and it's just getting worse and worse. Now, it's no surprise. The left has talked about this before. Bill Ayers, people who are in power now, were actually part of actual terrorist groups back in the 1970s who planned to lock up Republicans and lock up people they saw as reactionary. Bill Ayers, most notably, was a terrorist, and then he became a mentor to Obama and a contributor at MSNBC on certain occasions. So, you know, this is so hypocritical. But I want to talk about terrorism because that's what they're trying to say is that, you know, right-wingers are terrorists here or Republicans are terrorists. And he was saying in the context of, you know, they want to deprive people of all this free stuff, right? And that's part of it. They do like to say that. But he also had, you know, suggested that they were guilty of all these other horrible acts. And when you research this, you actually find that there's been tons of these pundits on the left calling Republicans terrorists, and even the left-wing media trying to paint a narrative that somehow right-wing terrorism is the biggest threat to America or that it's worse than Islamic terror. And this is completely not true. Now, what they're doing is sort of a complicated process here, because what they're doing is not just changing the statistics, but they're also changing the semantics of what we consider terrorism. And I'll tell you how. So when you count attacks by white supremacists and these kind of groups, religious groups, they are counting those as right-wing, even though the white supremacist groups that were committing terror attacks back in the 1960s and 70s, they were democratic groups. And they still are in many cases. So I grew up in Louisiana. All those Democratic Party members who you hear swapped parties back in the 1960s and 70s, they're still Democrats today. Many of those KKK Democrats still have family members in office, like the Landrieux. You had Robert Byrd. There's just been tons of these people who stayed in power and are still in the Democratic Party today. Even Hillary Clinton, who was waving a rebel flag around back in the 1980s and 90s. So that whole narrative is bogus. But they're also trying to say that people who committed terror attacks, like the Pulse nightclub shooting, if they weren't linked to a terrorist group, then they were considered right-wing domestic terrorists because they were religious or conservative in social issues. So therefore, like the nightclub shooter, they said, well, he's anti-gay, so we're going to call him a conservative and then put him in this right-wing category. But when you look at the actual facts, worldwide, according to ABC, the communist attacks worldwide are actually the fourth highest number, and that's under 3 others that would be considered Islamic. Well, actually 2 others, Boko Haram and then ISIS, or Islamic extremism as a whole. And then you had 4th was communist and socialist attacks. And right-wing attacks were nowhere to be found on that list. And when you look at Europe, about 0.3% of attacks in Europe were right-wing, compared to about 27% of attacks in Europe over the past 14 years were left-wing, and the rest were Islamic. And even Islamic terror, it's been on the rise. See, we're not counting certain things as Islamic terror, which is a problem. But when you count just strictly terror attacks linked to Islamic groups that are known terrorist groups, you have a huge increase. In 1991, it went from about 50 terror attacks a year by Islamic extremist groups to 2013 at about 800 a year. And it's a steady incline all the way up to 2013, where the data cut off. But you're talking about, over a 10-fold increase in terror attacks in a couple of decades. So, Islamic terror is definitely on the rise. Then you have the 60-plus terror attacks since 9/11 that were foiled by the FBI, and those numbers are never considered either. And out of those 60, about 58 of them were Islamic. So you have a lot of attempted attacks by Islamic terror groups out there. And then, like I said, you have the groups that are not considered Islamic because somehow they didn't want to tie them to it. And this is a problem with the media and the politicians in general. They don't have the political will to label people as left-wing or Islamic, where they have no problem labeling people right-wing. And we see that all over the place. We see it with the censorship in the social media. They have no problem, defending people who call for the murder of whites on social media. You have no problem defending this girl who's verified, who called for the death of all males, saying all males are rapists. This kind of stuff, the left and these globalists who run things, they want to set the narrative to try to blame whites, or in this case, they were calling anybody who was a white supremacist or even a white attacker as right-wing, which was totally unfair, and they wouldn't do that for any other group. But here's the problem, right? Is once they start calling people like us terrorists, they've already ostracized us with things like the censorship on the social media. We saw Steven Crowder's video where even Alexa was telling people that Jesus Christ was a myth, where she called, Muhammad a real prophet, and saying stats that were left-leaning or telling people misinformation. We see it with the people who are de-verified by Twitter. They want to ostracize us. They want to set the narrative and brainwash people to believing with the agenda that they want to push. So once they ostracize those people, the next step is to call them terrorists or dehumanize them in some way. And this is something that's constant throughout history with left-wing movements and also globalist movements. And once they dehumanize somebody and ostracize them, they have no problem getting rid of them. We've seen 200 million die at the hands of their own governments under communism and socialism. And that number would be much higher if you counted deaths by war or assassinations, things like that. That's just like gulags, work camps, death camps, things of that nature domestically in those communist and socialist states. So this is very dangerous. And we know this is their conclusion. Like I said, Bill Ayers, he was caught on tape talking about it, saying how he wanted to kill about a third of America. And this is a guy who walks the halls of power now. So when you have all these pundits talking this way, it's very alarming. And what was more alarming was when I actually did some research on this, and I went on Google and I typed in domestic terrorism right-wing groups. I mean, it was just a flush with Democratic senators, Democratic pundits, left-wing pundits, calling people on the right domestic terrorists, calling people who are like Donald Trump or Rand Paul domestic terrorists. And so the rhetoric is just completely out of control, and we need to reshape the narrative. We need to show people the stats and let them know that, this is a party. They're calling people who are hardworking Americans, salt of the earth people, terrorists. Meanwhile, the left and Islam are committing more terrorist attacks worldwide than any other groups. So, we got to shape this and fight back against this. It's very dangerous. All right, red pill.